morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jay Mayo, who has been a native of, or is a native of West Texas. He's had over 35 years of local pastoral ministry experience and a lot of different churches around Texas, including Stonegate, I've recently learned, and has recently decided to come back into the business world and also the nonprofit world. So he'll be able to tell us a little bit about that transition. Jay works in his business capacity with a company called Highsome Midstream, if I got that right. High Lonesome Midstream, I'm sorry. And then in his nonprofit work, currently he's working with a couple of different organizations. Epic Warrior Foundation is a nonprofit organization focusing on supporting first responders. And he's also involved in a group called Epicus Group. Hopefully I said that right. And that entity is providing counseling and leadership services to individuals and companies. So if you can give a warm welcome to Jay. Appreciate that.
All right. Am I supposed to use this mic? You want me to use the mic? You just check. I'll just talk. So if you can't hear me, let me know, and then I'll do the best I can to. Well, man, I am so excited to be here. I think about speaker bios, and which I hate. I actually had to write part of that. And speaker bios are like an obituary to me. They kind of hit the highlights of your life, right? And they only talk about the good stuff. You look back at all the years of a person's life and all the struggles and the mistakes and the failures that really were behind maybe a few of the moments in your life where you felt like you kind of figured it out. And that's what a speaker bio is, because today really what I want you to hear from my story is a lot of the struggles and failures and wrestles that I've walked through to try to make a difference in the world. So that's really what I want to talk about. Well, I'm grateful to be here for a couple of reasons. I got to thinking about the people who started this. We moved away in 2016. You'll hear me talk about that a little bit later. About that time, I think, is when a group of guys decided to start this gathering called Marketplace Midland. And what I'm grateful for is those men were so instrumental in shaping and influencing my life. Both directly and indirectly over the years, whether it was one-on-one conversations with them or whether it was watching them lead from a distance. I'm grateful because these men influenced my life. And so I just want to kind of publicly say thank you to Mark Dingler and Kevin Sparks and Steve McLaughlin and Steve Weatherall and Kyle Stallings, if I leave anybody out. Andy Deck, who's experienced the joy of a colonoscopy, I think, this morning. So he texted me last night and he said, I would rather be there with you. And I was like, good luck, brother. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you men, because really, you didn't just create a gathering based on a mission. I saw you live that out in your life, and thank you for your influence in my life. Which leads to the second reason I'm grateful to talk to you this morning, and that's the mission of Marketplace Midland. And so I don't know if this is your first time here, or maybe you've been coming from the beginning of this whole thing, but I want to read kind of the stated mission statement of Marketplace Midland. Listen to what they have on the website. We believe that God is interested in our entire week, not just our time on Sunday morning. Therefore, Marketplace Midland will endeavor to introduce helpful tools that will enable all of us to integrate the timeless biblical principles into modern business. I love that mission. And as I read it, I thought about, I kind of translated it into a couple of questions I think it really infers for you and I. Like, it's kind of challenging us to talk about a couple of questions to ask that and then answer those in our life. And here are the two questions I think it's really asking. How do I make a difference as a follower of Jesus at this intersection of faith and work? Or maybe to ask the question a different way that I'll unpack a little bit in a few moments. How do you make a living and make a difference in the world for God at the same time? Is that possible? To really make a living, but make a difference at the same time. And so I can be encouraged in my journey of faith that 1 or 2 days a week that I may be with my faith family, wherever you're connected. But how in the world do I translate that faith experience, that journey with Jesus, into all the other 6 days of my life? How do I make that transition happen? I think that's the heart behind Marketplace Midland. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. My hope is to tell you a little bit of my story, a little bit of my story of faith, but also this wrestle in my life of trying to answer that question, where it emerged in my life and how I tried to answer it. And so I hope you're not expecting me to have all the right answers, because really you're going to hear me wrestle with answering it kind of the wrong way most of my life. And then later in life, I think by God's grace, coming to understand a better answer to that question. And so again, I just want to share my story of all of that with you today. And so my story of faith and life kind of began about 90 miles northeast of here in a little town called Snyder, Texas. And so I always joke about Snyder this way, that Snyder was one of those places everyone goes through on the way to somewhere important. That's how it was. And here's why I say that. Of all the years when I've talked to people and they say, where are you from? And I was like, I'm from Snyder. And they always say this, oh, Snyder, we went through there on the way to Lubbock. We went through there on the way to Abilene. I've never in all those years heard anyone say, oh yeah, Snyder. I took my wife there for our 10th anniversary. We stayed at the Purple Sage Motel all weekend. We made some amazing memories. I've never, ever heard anyone say that about Snyder. But unlike some people that can't wait to get out of their hometown, that wasn't me. I love that place. I still love that place. The people of that town invested and loved me and shaped who I am as a person today. And so I'm so grateful for Snyder. And so just a few weeks ago, I got the chance to go back there with some of the work I do with a nonprofit that he mentioned. I'm president of Epic Warrior Foundation that focuses on first responders. That's a plug for sure. If you want to know any more about how to be involved in that, just catch me afterwards. But I was over there talking with the local police department, and I had one more meeting with the fire department before that, or after that. And so I thought, I'm just going to drive around. It's been so long since I've been back there. I just wanted to drive around that town and just remember. And so I drove back to the house where I grew up, and it was so many memories as I pulled up to that curb. And the weird thing is it's still painted lime green, the color that my dad had us paint those asbestos shingles, which by the way, were still on that house. And I creeped around and went up the alley to look at the back of the house, and there was that carport my brother and my dad and I all built together. It was a little bit beat up, but it was still there. And I just thought about all the memories in that place. Then I drove up 36th Street, kind of up a hill, and I was going toward the elementary school where I went to elementary school, and I topped the hill, and it was gone. They tore it down, which was a little disappointing. And I think a rumor on the street was that they had to tear it down because of all the traumatic memories the teachers had from having me as a kid there. Most of those left the profession after I was there. So I pulled in the parking lot, and I just sat there for a little bit and started remembering all the people, again, that had invested in my life. And at the same time, I thought I had some of my most memorable beatings at East Elementary. Back in the day when discipline was like a combat sport, I don't know if you're old enough, you paid for what you did wrong. And so then I drove over to the junior high and over by the old high school. And again, I thought about all the people that have poured into my life and all the teachers and coaches. I drove by the baseball field, which still today holds so many memories of this childhood passion I had playing baseball. And then I drove downtown, right? And if you're from a small town, we call it the square, because it's just like four streets in a square, and that's it. And so I drove to downtown Snyder to the First Baptist Church. I just sat there in front of that church. And I thought about how this place, the people of this place, this church, God used them to change my life. And I kept thinking about this couple specifically. Their names were John and Dee Dee Burke. And they were volunteers in the student ministry. He was an engineer for one of the majors that changed names about once a week. So I don't even remember which one it was. And she was an English teacher at the high school. And they had known my parents over the years, but for some reason they decided that they just wanted to love me, encourage me, and invest in my life. And they started showing up with my parents to every baseball game and every sporting event. They just cheered me on and encouraged me. And I couldn't figure out why these people cared enough to just invest in my life. And so I didn't start going to First Baptist Snyder really until my high school years. And so at some point between my junior and senior year, they called my folks and said, hey, we want to talk to Jay about something we would like for him to come to. And so they came over to the house and they're like, hey, Jay, we want to pay for you to go to youth camp. And I was like, what's youth camp? That sounds a little creepy. And so they were like, well, we gather all these students on a bus and we drive out into the country and we go to this encampment out there. And, there's no TVs, there's no phones. And we spend the whole week just talking about God. And I didn't say this out loud, but I was like, I've heard that story before. That's called the Guyana tragedy. That's like the Jim Jones cult. Like you drink the Kool-Aid at the end. I was like, I did not want to go to that. But I couldn't get past these people that would take the time with everything going on in their life to try to make a difference in my life. And so I figured out I don't want to offend them, so I got to come up with an alibi. So all of the years of high school, I worked at the same time at a place in Snyder called Safeway Grocery Store, where I was a checker and a sacker and all that stuff. I'd work on the weekends with my school schedule, but sometimes I'd work during the week. So that next day I went down to my boss and I was like, listen, dude, I got these people that are trying to force me to go to this cult camp. And so what I need you to do is I need you to schedule me to work that Monday of this week of June. Just do that, right? Don't give me any feedback. And he's like, 10-4, I'll put you on the schedule. So the next time I saw John and Dee Dee, they were, of course, asked me about camp and what I thought, and I just played it off. I was like, man, I really, really want to go to this camp. I can't stop thinking about it. It's super exciting. However, here's the deal. I got to work that Monday. I can't get out of it. And so John looked at me and he was like, well, that's a bummer because, they leave on Sunday night and they head to camp. And he's like, probably not going to work out. And then I looked at Dee Dee. She was about that tall. He was about that tall. So they were like really, I shouldn't say. They were a sweet couple. And so I looked at Dee Dee and I could tell things were turning in her head. And she looked at me and she looked at John and she said, that's okay. John and I can drive you up Tuesday morning. And so I wasn't prepared for that. She kind of busted me, caught me flat-footed. So she's like, will that work? And I just was like, yeah, that'd be great. And so a couple of weeks later on a Tuesday morning, we left Snyder, Texas, and we drove to Buffalo Gap, Texas, outside of Abilene to the little bitty Baptist encampment. And that day changed my life forever. We walked into this encampment and the student minister was talking to everyone about having a devotional time with God. I was like, what is a devotional time with God? Again, sounds a little culty to me. And so I just would listen all the way on the back row and he just kept talking about Jesus in a way that caught me off guard. I'd never heard anyone talk about Jesus in this way, that you could have a relationship with Jesus. I knew about Jesus, but this idea that I could have a relationship with Jesus was intriguing to me. And he talked about the reality that he cares about your life, cares about all your life, your experiences, your struggles. You can talk to him about everything. And you can actually hear him through the Word of God talk back to you, that you could have this daily relationship in which Jesus can lead your life. And I can remember in that moment, it just resonated within me because here was the truth. I was so deeply captivated by loneliness and fear in my life. I had great parents. I didn't have any reason, but I always felt overwhelmed that life was just up to me, and I always felt like I just wasn't prepared to figure it out. I didn't know how to figure it out. I didn't know why I was here and what I was supposed to be doing. And the thought that someone would just walk with me. In that moment, I thought, if that's true, I want to know more about that. And so he dismissed us to go have our devotional time with God, and I didn't really know what to do. He said, find a quiet place and talk to God. So I remember going out under this big tree and sitting down against this tree, and for the first time ever, trying to pray and talk to Jesus. And it was something like this: Jesus, if you're real, if you really love me, then I want to trust you with my life. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I can tell you what I'm doing is not working, and I just feel like my life is such a mess. Jesus, if you are real, I want to give you my life. I'll follow you wherever you lead me. And what I didn't know in those moments was what that prayer would mean in my life. I didn't know how that would all impact my life, but here's what I knew: it would forever change the trajectory of my life, not just in eternity, but for my life in the present. Because what began to happen in me is I believed that day I wasn't just saying yes to Jesus for salvation. I really believed I was saying yes to Jesus, to this invitation to follow him, and to this mission that he came to give his life for. And so from that moment on, I can remember just being captivated by this burden to try to tell every person that I cross paths with about the possibility that you can just not know God or know about God, but you can know him personally. And so that was the beginning of my faith journey, but it really kind of turned the page into this season of my life in where I would intersect faith and work. Coming out of my senior year, as so many of all of us in this room, what I began to be hammered with is this relentless question by counselors and teachers, and here was basically the question, you probably heard it in different forms: what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What are you going to do? What are you going to do to make a living? What career are you going to choose? What job are you going to do? And some of that was important to know what the next step was. How are you going to prepare for that job? And I can remember feeling the pressure as a senior, like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I just barely figured out the meaning of the part of meaning of life. What do you mean, what am I going to do? And so I can remember feeling this pressure to answer the question, what are you going to do to make a living? So I had this question kind of on one ear, and then the other ear, again, there was another question inside of me that had come out of this profound encounter with Jesus. And it was a similar question, but different. And it sounded a little bit like this: well, how are you going to make a difference in this world for God? And so I had both of these questions I was wrestling with. And again, it felt like I was at this intersection of how does faith intersect the rest of life? How does faith intersect what I'm going to, quote, do with the rest of my life? How am I going to make a difference in this world from God and somehow at the same time make a living? And so really both of these questions seem vitally important, but I have to be honest with you, they didn't seem connected to me in that moment. Like they weren't even in the same categories, really. Because I kept thinking, well, I'll do something for a living, but then I'll try to make a difference in the world. But in that moment in my life, they didn't either connect. I didn't think that there was an intersection between the two of them. And here's why. Again, all I can do is speak from my experience. But growing up in that small West Texas town, very religious town, I had heard a narrative, and then I heard it more as the end of my senior year kind of unfolded. And it was a narrative, really, I realized, about these two questions. And it was centered around this idea of calling, right? And it would go something like this, at least from me growing up there, that there was this picture, well, some people are called to the ministry. And they would even use these terms, surrender to the ministry, which is a really, really peculiar way to, like God just backed me in a corner. I ran as far as I could. I finally waved the white flag, and I'm like, okay, you got me. There's no way out. I give up. I'll do what you ask me. I'm like, what a peculiar way to describe that because it wasn't the same for me. I was like, I'll go. You don't have to talk me into it. But there were those people who were called to the ministry, and then there was another group of people who were called to the business world. That's how I understood the narrative growing up. And so both of them made a difference in the world, and where some maybe did this, quote, full-time in the ministry, other people supported that and tried to figure out a way to also make a difference. But it seemed like those were the two answers to the question, how do you make a difference in the world? The problem was when I started reading the Bible with this newfound faith, and I started digging into the words of Jesus, what I ended up realizing is I couldn't find either of those perspectives. That's not what I was reading. Because I kept just seeing one call, like there's one calling to follow Jesus. There's not these other callings. That there was one invitation to follow Jesus into the mission that He'd given His life to. And so really for the first time in my life, those questions started to merge together. How do you make a living? How do you make a difference in the world? And again, I started asking myself, well, how do I make a difference in the world and make a living at the same time? Right? How is that possible? How do I make a living and at the same time try to figure out how to have the greatest impact in the world as a follower of Jesus? And so that's what I began to try to ask and answer in my life. And so what would happen for the next 25 years is I would answer that question a couple of ways, and I referenced at the beginning, like, I think one of them was okay, but hopefully you'll see, like, I don't think it was the best answer to the question. And I think sometimes it's the main answer we as men embrace as the answer to the question. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But I really think by God's grace, He helped me to see a better answer to the question. Unfortunately, it was only about 5 or 6 years ago. And I don't think my life is a waste. I'm just trying to say, I hope today that you can learn from some things that were mistakes, I think, in my life. But here's the first way I answer that question. How do you make a living and make a difference in the world for God? And what I kind of centered it around is this answer, and some of these are questions that are the same thing. I thought the most important thing I need to figure out is what I was meant to do in this world for God. That's what I got to figure out. That I was meant to do something. I think that's what people are saying to me. You were meant to do something. And I want to figure out what it was in the world I was meant to do for God. And so I figured if I could find the right job or the right context, then it allowed me the greatest opportunity to make a living and make a difference. And so that's what I began to do. I tried to figure out what's the deal? What's the job? What's the context? And that would unfold over the next 20 plus years of my life. And man, it would send me all over the map employment-wise. I mean, I'm a little embarrassed. Like, I really do feel embarrassed. I'm thinking, you guys are going to listen in a second and go, oh, what is, like, this guy's supposed to be giving advice? I was all over the employment map. You're going to hear and you go, like, if there was a such thing as career ADHD, like, this guy had it. Like, if I was your kid, you would be like, I don't know how to lead this kid. He's hopeless. He's all over the map. But I took a few moments last few weeks, and I just looked back on every job I've ever did. And some of the questions at your tables kind of dive into that this morning. But I started thinking from the very first job, man, I've done a lot of different things. Not just as a kid. Like, I'm all over the place. So it started at the grocery store that I mentioned, the Safeway grocery store. But then it dove into so many different areas. I went into construction for a season. I was in landscaping. Then I went into the restaurant kind of industry, and I was there for a season. Then I went into retail sales, and then I was a courier and a delivery driver in the Metroplex for a while. But then I went into the banking world. And I was a bank teller and a customer service representative. And then I ended up doing this thing called community development coordinator in the inner city of Dallas. And at some point over the course of that time, I, with a friend, helped start this little chemical company out here, this little production. It wasn't even production chemical company because we just like did one thing, foamer. Like, we found a niche and it's like, let's do that. We're too stupid to do anything else. So we started this little company, really by accident, by the way, because we didn't think it was going to take, and it did. And then ultimately to kind of end up today where I'm back in the oil and gas industry with this really lofty title that I had to create for myself because they didn't know what to call me. So like, what do you do? I'm like, well, I try to develop the staff and team, and I can see kind of gaps in our organization that keep people from flourishing. So why don't you just call me staff and organizational development? So I created that name by myself. So I did not get hired and interviewed for that job, and they were like, you're the right person. They're like, can you just figure out what you do and write it down on a piece of paper? And I was like, sure. But here's the thing. When you see that, you're like, man, that's all over the map. Like, pick a lane. What did you go to school for? You don't even know that because I'm all over the map there. But like, you did so many. But I'm like, it gets worse than that. Because I was also one of those people that we used to call bivocational. And what that really meant is like, you just had two jobs all the time. As long as I can remember, I always had two jobs. Most of the time I was trivocational, especially when we had kids and we were poor. I was doing 2 or 3 things at one time. But all of my life, I also had this other pathway alongside all of these things I just described. Always had a side hustle. And so alongside everything I just described to you, I was also a student pastor. I was also a college pastor. I was also a missions pastor and a church planter and a worship leader, an associate pastor. I was also a hospice chaplain, a spiritual care coordinator. I was a law enforcement chaplain. And so when I look back on all that again, like I feel like, man, I feel super embarrassed. Like you probably again can't hear all of that and think, what a confused and misguided young man you were. And I would say, yeah, I can't disagree with that. But the bigger question was, why was I doing that? What was I trying to figure out? Again, I go back to that driving question in my life. How do I make a living and make a difference in the world for God at the same time? How do I try to make a difference at this intersection of faith and work? That's what I was trying to figure out. And I convinced myself that it really was the greatest problem. I convinced myself that I needed to figure out what I was meant to do in this world for God. What was I meant to do? That's how we define it as men. Ever walk to a conversation, what's the first question you know is going to come up in the first 30 seconds? So, what do you do? Right? I know it's us trying to be icebreaking, but like that's how we define ourselves. What do you do? It's really a dumb question when you think about it. In light of what I'm going to say, this would be a really awkward question when I tell you the other way I answered this. But I had centered my life around trying to figure out, God, what was I meant to do in this world for you? And so luckily, what began to happen is God would disrupt this perspective for me about faith and work and how they intersected. And He would do it in the context of some of the most heartbreaking and difficult moments in my life. In 2016, after being here over 20 years, we decided we were going to leave Midland. Again, we had an opportunity to try to pursue something we felt like would make a difference in the world. And so we were moving to the Hill Country to be a part of a couple of different things. And at the same time, it was this chance to kind of live a dream out with my folks. We'd always sit around the table and my dad, and we talk about, like hundreds of us do. We ought to buy some land in the Hill Country. That whole like famous, let's buy some land in the Hill Country, till you look at the price and you're like, what are these people like? They think this land is worth. So we'd put it off and put it off. My dad was about to retire and I said, Dad, we want to move to the Hill Country, a northwest Austin area, and we're going to pursue these things. And why don't you guys come with us? And let's buy that land. Let's do that thing we always said. And my dad was like, let's do it. And so it was supposed to be a 6-month transition, but it turned into a 2-year struggle. And what happened is, at the end of those 2 years, what we knew clearly was the sobering realization that my folks weren't healthy enough to follow after this dream. Because at the early part of that transition, my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, right in the middle of it. I mean, we had a foot in the boat and one on the dock, and we found that out. And so over those 2 years, we tried everything we could do to try to figure out how to make that happen. We'd already bought 25 acres in Northwest Austin. We'd already just completed this house that was perfect for both of us, where I could look out my kitchen door and see my dad across the courtyard. Every morning I could go drink coffee with him. And it was the perfect spot for us to like stay out of our business, but like if you fall, I can come pick you up, right? It was kind of like we moved them in before they needed to be moved in. It was the beautiful house we designed together, but they never got a chance to live in it. They came and visited a couple of times, but they never got a chance to live in it. And so, due to my dad's pancreatic cancer and a lot of prayer and a lot of grieving, we just sold it all and walked away from all of it and moved back to Midland, that we knew we needed to be with them with no jobs, no idea what we were going to do, but just be back here. So 2018, I show back up to Midland, and what happened was it seemed like every door seemed to close for the things I thought I was meant to do in this world for God. Again, God's trying to help me see it different. Because of timing or lack of opportunity, every door seemed to be closed. And what ended up happening is the only door that was like cracked open almost felt like it was default. Having a conversation one day with some long-term friends, they're like, "What are you going to do?" I'm like, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I just know I need to be here." The other guy walks in and is like, "Why don't you come do something for us until you figure out what you're going to do?" I was like, "Well, I don't know. Y'all don't, I'm so ignorant about what y'all do." It's funny, the words "do." Like, I don't even know what y'all do. "Well, you can come figure out what we do." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll just do that until I figure out what I'm going to do." And so it felt like this is not like a well thought out plan. And I step into this company, this group of companies back in the oil and gas industry. And so again, I confused about, God, why is every door seem to be closed for me to do what I thought I was meant to do in this world? Well, although we'd moved back primarily because of my dad's health, here's what began to unfold. Within just a few months of us moving back, my mom was on her way, and I was going with them just to have a routine test at the hospital. And she would go into cardiac respiratory arrest on the front porch of the hospital and actually die, and they would resuscitate her. Took her to the ER, put her in CCU, and within 6 days, she was gone. And we were stunned, like, what? Like, whoa, this wasn't supposed to be like this. It's my dad who's sick. And then what would unfold is that almost to the date, a year later, on March 13th, 2020, I'd be sitting at the bedside of my father in a hospice unit, holding his hand. And I'd lean down and kiss him on the forehead for the last time. And I said what I had helped hundreds of people say to their loved one: "Dad, I love you. I'm going to be okay. It's okay to go. Go see Mom. Go see Barry, my brother who passed away in 2006. Go see your mom and dad. Dad, I love you. I'm going to be okay. I will see you soon." And he took one breath and passed away. And over the next few weeks and months, I just had some hard conversations with God, and that's really beautiful. Actually, they were arguments. And I can remember being out on an SWD location north of town on the ranch that we operate on, and just having one of those moments like, "God, what is going on? Like, the story wasn't meant to turn out like this." And in the middle of all this story, here I am, like feeling like an idiot, working in this industry I don't really know that well. Like, what are you doing, God? Why won't you let me do what I was meant to do in this world for you? God answered that question. And He would unpack it over the next few years. And for the first time, I realized I've been answering the question wrong. I was asking the right question, but I'd been answering this question wrong all this time. And God in His grace was trying to work through this moment to help me see there's a better answer to this question. There's a better way that this question and this answer positions your life really for the greatest impact at the corner or intersection of faith and work. And here's kind of what God said back to me. Listen, stop worrying about the context. Stop worrying about trying to figure out what you were meant to do in this world. You need to figure out who you were meant to be to this world. Let me say that again. Stop trying to figure out what you were meant to do in this world, and start trying to figure out who I called you to be to this world. And what began to make sense to me is that God had created and shaped you and I, that I would be a reflection, a unique reflection of who God is to the world, that He created and intended for me to be someone to the world, not to do something in the world. That would follow by default. But the most important impact I could have in the world, wherever I'm at, no matter what job I'm in, is to be the person He intended for me to be. I'll share this verse, and I'm not even going to comment much on it. This was the verse He kept taking me to, Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. God saved you by His grace when you believed. You can't take credit for that. It's a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done. So none of us can boast about that. There's the verse that really, I think, is still imprinted in my heart about this. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things He planned long beforehand for us to do. And in the context of the truth of that verse, God was saying, listen, I shaped you to be a masterpiece, a reflection to the world of who I am. Stop worrying about what you're supposed to do in this world and just be who you were meant to be. Reflect who I am. And so it started making sense for me. It didn't really matter all those years, all the things I had done, and all the time I spent worrying about trying to find the perfect context, because I thought if I could find the perfect context, this intersection of faith and work, I'd have the greatest impact, all the time forgetting it's just who I am. Here's the cool thing. The people I work with kept telling me to do that. I kept going, y'all got to hire somebody smarter than me. At one point, I was the COO of this company. I'm like, like if those people, I don't know if anyone's here from any of the operators that we worked with, but I'd laugh. I'm like, if Concho knew, if they just asked one more question, when I was leading that operations meeting, I would be like Chris Farley and I don't know what I'm talking about. I would lead operations meeting with our team and Concho, and just be like, I'd be answering these questions. And I knew about 2 questions deep. But I kept saying, y'all got to get somebody different. And they're like, you can learn this. We just need you to be who God made you to be. That's what we want on this team. They were saying that the whole time, but I never believed it. And so God finally, through this difficult transition in my life, just allowed me to take a deep breath and just say, stop worrying about what you were meant to do. Start focusing on who you were meant to be to the world. So today I struggle because I wish I could come to you and have some profound leadership principle to share with you that would change the course of your leadership in history. But I'm not that smart, and you probably aren't either. So here's what I want to challenge you with. Stop worrying about your career path. Stop worrying about the trajectory of your career. Stop worrying about what you were meant to do or accomplish in this world. Your calling is not found there. In all of those contexts, I'm challenging you to shift your life and the focus of your life to who God meant you to be in this world for this moment in His story in history. Of all the conversations I ever had at the bedside of people as a hospice chaplain, no one ever said, I wish I'd worked one more day. I wish I'd done one more thing. You know, all of the regrets are centered around, did my life make a difference? Did my life make a difference? Can you make a living and make a difference in this world for God? Absolutely. You just got to answer the question right. Focus on who God meant you to be to this world, and you'll definitely make a difference. Let me pray for you. God, all I know in this moment is you've led me to be here and stand in front of these men and talk about my story. I don't. What I trust in is that. And so I pray that for a guy here today that's in the struggle, that he would find the right answer to the question. I pray for someone who feel like they're so late in life, can I ever turn the corner, that you would restore hope in them and say, be the person you were created to be with the life you have left. But God, thank you for saving me and rescuing me and helping me to see that you have shaped me and created me to reflect who you are wherever I'm at in the world. God, we want to live lives that make a difference. Thank you for doing that in us. In Jesus' name, amen.